6:36 on Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. Good morning to you, friends. Dan Mandis here along with Joan Jones, Johnny B, and EJ Antoni is joining us this morning. EJ, always great to have you on the phone. You are an economist. We've seen you on Fox News and other places as well. EJ, always great to have you on. I wanted to bring you on because the former president, Donald Trump, saying that he wants to replace income taxes with tariffs. Now, EJ, all across the media this morning, you see all of these dire predictions of what's going to happen to our economy if Donald Trump implements these, as some say, draconian tariffs against, in my opinion, evil forces like China and other nations as well. But talk a little bit about Trump's tariff plan. Could he actually replace income taxes with tariffs?
Well, Dan, thanks for having me. And first off, I find it interesting the same people with all these dire predictions right now are the same ones who had similarly dire predictions when Trump first got into office. I remember some of them even going so far as to say, sell all your stocks because he's going to crash the market. And then it proceeded to just set record high after record high. So let's not believe all the doomsayers and the naysayers here. But, it's absolutely possible to do it. And in fact, it has been done before. We forget that before 1913, which is most of the nation's history, we didn't have an income tax. Instead, what we had was a federal government that was much smaller and funded itself almost exclusively by tariffs. So this idea that it's never been done or that it's impossible, the record of history just doesn't support that. And you can do it again.
One of the things, and the president talks about William McKinley often, and he calls McKinley something like the king of taxes or the king of tariffs, and among other things. He likes McKinley a lot because McKinley did use tariffs. You're going to know a lot more about this than me. But from what I understand, McKinley, his whole thing was he basically wanted tariffs to be the same. So, for example, if Mexico had a tariff on our goods, 15% exporting into Mexico, then he wanted us to have an import tariff of 15% as well. Is it possible that for President Trump, everybody knows that it's always like the art of the deal. It's a game to him. Part of this could be that he is just setting the stage for negotiations with China and with Mexico if he ultimately ends up in office?
Well, one of the things that Trump did during the first term is that he took tariffs from simply being if you want to think of it as strategic bombing, and he turned it into tactical bombing. In other words, it's not simply just we're going to use this as a general revenue measure, but now we're actually going to use this as a surgical tool to get what we want in international negotiations. We are, in other words, going to weaponize the purchasing power of the American people and potentially close off some of our markets, our consumer markets, to foreigners. And it worked incredibly well during his first term, and I just see no reason to believe why it wouldn't work very well in his second term, especially since now he already has the measure of a lot of these other world leaders, and he already has some experience under his belt, and they got to see even more so what exactly works and what doesn't.
So is part of the Trump plan, if he really does want to do this, replace income taxes with tariffs, I'm assuming that part of that equation, and we did see this during the first administration when he cut taxes and regulations, people had more money in their pocket. So is part of the equation here that Trump is following, is it that, okay, so if I eliminate income taxes and I charge all these tariffs, I impose all these tariffs on foreign goods, then the American people are going to have more money in their pocket to spend. And then, of course, what that does with the sales taxes and all that is that gives the government more money via sales taxes, and that means more income for the government in that way.
Yeah, it's pretty simple to just swap out one kind of tax, for another, and that's essentially what's happening here. Trump wants to basically stop taxing domestic trade, which is what happens when you have a domestic income tax or a domestic sales tax. you are taxing a kind of domestic trade. So he wants to stop that and replace it with a tax on international trade. And I think there's a lot of benefits to that, not the least of which is the fact that you are helping to support your fellow Americans and you're reducing the support that you're giving to foreigners. And look, it's not that we hate foreigners. It's just that we happen to like our fellow Americans more. That's all. And so, again, I think there's a lot of support for this idea, and it's not just simply theoretical, but there's empirical evidence as well. We have done it here in the United States, and you've seen it done in other countries around the world. When you reduce one kind of tax, you can simply replace it with another.
What happens? So one of the other things that I liked that Trump is saying is, okay, so if you make your widgets in America versus your widgets in, I don't know, whatever, China, South Korea, whatever. But if you make your widgets in America, you get a lower tax rate for your business. That's part of the equation here, too. Did he do that in his first term?
Not exactly. The bigger thing that he did was the reduction in regulation. And,
yep.
What essentially happened here was, let me, if we have time, let me give you a quick example. A typical manufacturing worker, I'm going to round some of the numbers here. Let's say makes about $50,000. But that's just the direct compensation to the employee. There is indirect compensation. In other words, there are costs to the business where they have to pay things like taxes on that worker. They have to pay benefits packages, etc. So imagine all of that together is another $50,000. But you also have regulatory cost, a regulatory burden that is paid by the manufacturer, by the employer. That's going to be about another 50 or 75 grand even. And so what looks like a $50,000 employee is actually somewhere between, $150,000, maybe $175,000 employee from the cost perspective of the business. And so it's key that you get that regulatory burden down so that people can return manufacturing to the United States, so that businesses can return to the United States, so that you can reverse that corporate inversion. In other words, get people to bring jobs and bring manufacturing back here to America. Reducing that regulatory burden actually provided even more of an incentive for businesses than the tax reform of 2017 did, believe it or not.
Oh, yeah. The regulations, the cutting of regulations was a very big deal. And it seems like to me, because I'm not a financial guy, so I rely on people like you, but it seems like what Trump is doing is he's got sort of this cauldron of ideas, right, where he wants to extend and even strengthen the Trump tax cuts. He wants to charge these tariffs. He's talking about flirting with the idea of replacing income taxes with tariffs. I mean, there's a lot of things that he wants to do. Of course, drill, baby, drill. And one of the things that I thought that was really a great part of the conversation with Joe Rogan was where he spoke about the American assets.
$35 trillion right now. It's a lot. But if you look at the asset value, if you looked at it purely as an asset value, we have oil underground, we have water, we have mountains, the assets are so enormous. But regardless of that, we've got $35 trillion in debt, we should pay it off. And we would have started paying off debt and probably even given further tax reductions. I want to get it down to 15%.
So that is former President Donald Trump and Joe Rogan talking about the $35 trillion debt that we currently have. And the question to Trump was, when are we going to start paying off the debt? But he talked about the assets that we have here in America. I'm pretty certain that you and I would both agree that we're not taking advantage of those assets. But taking advantage of those assets is a big part of what Trump wants to do if he wins re-election.
100%, Dan. You're absolutely right here. And look, part of the problem goes back, in other words, a big reason why we're not taking advantage of those assets goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the regulatory burden, where you have a government that during one administration says, oh, sure, you can drill here. Here's your permit, and here's your lease, and here are all your environmental clearances, et cetera. And then you fast forward to this administration where they have revoked all of those. Or even if they haven't revoked all of them, they've at least revoked one. A big talking point from the Biden-Harris administration has repeatedly been, we've extended more leases. We've extended more permits for drilling, that is. But what they're not telling you, the dirty little secret, is that they're only extending one or the other when you need both. In other words, they are purposely extending essentially one bureaucratic nod to a company while taking away permission with another bureaucratic agency. And so the end result is that they can goose the numbers and make it look like they are allowing more drilling or more production, when in reality they are just throwing more roadblocks in the way of drillers, of the producers, of the refiners, et cetera.
So the first thing, and you're right, it's one thing to say, hey, we're extending the leases or whatever it is, but then the regulatory process, and I've interviewed, people that are experts in the oil industry. I've interviewed you a number of times on this. Basically, the bottom line is, yeah, you're right. What they're doing is they're saying that they're opening these leases up, but the reality is that they make it so incredibly complicated to get through the regulatory process that it's just darn right, well, impossible. And so that impacts, obviously, the cost of gasoline and everything associated with it. Is there a concern? Final question here, EJ. Is there a concern? Do you have a concern? Because this is one of the big issues that people are worried about with these tariffs, that if we charge tariffs to China and Mexico and so forth, then that would ultimately lead to higher prices of those goods, those tariffs, because the Harris campaign is calling this basically a tax hike is what they're calling it. I don't believe that it's a tax hike, because a tax hike, you actually don't have any choice but to pay those taxes. You can decide whether or not to buy a certain thing. But that being said, is there a worry that these tariffs would increase the prices of goods across America?
No, Dan, there's really not a worry, unless you're one of the people who were wrong the first time Trump was president. Going back to what we had said originally, the same people saying today that the sky is falling, Trump's going to kill us all. I'm sorry, but those were the same people who were completely wrong about all of his economic policies the first time around. So history is clearly not on their side. But furthermore, theory isn't on their side either. In economics, we have something we like to call tax incidence, which means that just because you tax person A doesn't mean person A actually pays the tax. The corporate income tax is a great example of this. Corporations don't pay taxes. When they get charged an income tax by the government, they simply charge their customers higher prices. They pay their workers lower wages, and their shareholders see a lower rate of return. So the tax incidence of the corporate income tax falls on those three groups of people. And when you have tariffs, during the first Trump administration, for example, over 80 cents on the dollar was not paid by American consumers. They paid less than 20 cents on the dollar of all the tariffs that Trump imposed. So where did the other 80 cents come from? It came from places like Chinese manufacturers who simply had to eat the cost of those tariffs, which is great because those are the same Chinese manufacturers who were getting subsidized by the Chinese government to give them an unfair advantage. So most of those Trump tariffs, all they simply did was try to create a more level playing field for American producers. I'd say that's a win-win. You basically have a Chinese company that's sending tax revenue to the United States Treasury.
And the bottom line is, if they want access to the American market, they got to deal with the tariffs, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right, Dan.
All right, EJ, how can people find you on X?
X is going to be the best platform to find me on, and the handle there is @RealEJ Antoni, Antoni.